We know the leaders set the tone around their cultures, but what happens to the employee experience when leaders aren't developed? What does that mean to the business?
On this episode of Confessions of a CX Executive, we uncover how coaching, not metrics, creates winning teams and stronger businesses.
When you work in the CX function, there's so much built around an escalation culture because customers are demanding that. Part of this challenge is that whole notion of why is it leaders get stuck in the doing versus managing it. Are you a teacher or are you a fixer? If every time I work for you, you're a fixer, it's an escalation culture where I don't feel empowered.
Let's put some dollars on the table now. In the era of automation and leadership, why does leadership still matter? Hey everyone, we're going to talk a little bit about leadership development today. This is the revenue lever that most people don't talk about. Now, I want to welcome you to this week's edition of Confessions of a CX Executive. As I mentioned, leadership is one of those unsung heroes of your revenue business. So if you've got leaders who can't coach, can't connect, then there's no tool in the world that's going to help you. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. So most folks think that customer experience is about bots, about a dashboard, and about the shiniest tech. But it's so much more than that. It is a force multiplier to drive your revenue engine in your business. So when these things go haywire, this is when I bring in reinforcements. So today's guest is Dan Gallagher, and he spent a number of years developing leaders, putting together training programs, and really helping you unlock the overall potential of your team. So I'm going to toss the mic over to Dan, and he's going to tell you a little bit about who he is, what he's doing now.
Thanks, JP. It's wonderful to reconnect, and I'm a huge fan. I was listening just this past week to your podcast on the IVR, and it really made me think about where the world is, right? As organizations try to accelerate, right? There are things that you have to digitize, and there are things you have to humanize. Yeah. And the leaders that do it successfully, because it's leaders that do it, it's not companies that do it. People are actually making these decisions of how to bring digitization, how to bring automation, and how to bring humanization together, right? To make these experiences, right? Like you think about your journey as an employee or your journey as a leader, and some of what drives your attention and your amount of effort is all based on experiences that come from goosebumps or the opposite. When I think about this connective tissue between EX and CX and how do we grow leaders, I often reflect on a conversation I was having with a C-suite member in a retail organization. And she said, everything we do comes down to two things. It comes down to discretionary effort and engagement. And those two are deeply embedded with each other. And so what I've spent most of my career on is helping leaders understand that, one, you got to slow yourself down to speed yourself up, self-awareness. And two, you have to proactively manage how you add value as a leader. And my goal is to create comfortable learning and experiences for individuals, teams, and organizations so that, and this is how we met, so that you can poke a bit and sit there and say, is that pattern of how leadership shows up leaning into the future, or is it relying on the past, right? Do you have 1 foot in today, 1 foot in tomorrow, like 1 foot in yesterday, 2 feet in yesterday? And so that's the work that I do, is really working with leaders to accelerate how they create value. And to the points you make across all of your work in the CX work, it comes from not just being great in the vertical functional area that you have, it comes from that lateral horizontal leadership. And that's what I think we can spend some time on today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I appreciate about, what you bring to the table is that you're very good at moving folks away from just looking at the spreadsheet and having managers who are drowning in that, and then reeling those folks in who treat coaching as kryptonite, and then level setting for some of our executives who sometimes think leadership development is a TED Talk or a retreat. This is really a living, breathing thing that we have to do every day. So I'm really glad that you're here. I'm going to jump right into it. We know the leaders set the tone around their cultures, but what happens to the employee experience when leaders aren't developed? So really want to understand that connective tissue around EX drives CX. So when those leaders aren't developed, what does that mean to the business?
Well, you're right. It does start from the relationship between execs and middle management, right? And I'm a firm believer that you've got executives sitting in conference rooms, virtually or in person, and they're looking for middle managers to do more. And you've got those middle managers sitting in conference rooms or on calls, and they're kind of water cooling around the concept of, why won't my executives give me more permission to be more innovative? So you've got this spin cycle, right, of execs wanting more from middle managers wanting permission from execs. What does that do to your frontline supervisors and your frontline employees? It puts them in a steady pattern of whatever is, right? And so they see they're closest to the customer, they're closest to the tools, right? They're closest to the patterns that are productive and the patterns that are painful. And what they're not able to do is grab middle management's attention, right, to sit there and say, what if we pivot? What if we reinvent? And that's the piece here of like, are we waiting for permission to be innovative, right? And you and I grew up together in an organization that just loved to speak about the entrepreneurial flair of leadership. And that's really what we're talking about. It's not about just sitting there and saying, you need to have X number of coaching meetings a month with somebody, right? It's around using your mindset to shape how others perform. And it's thinking about it in a profitable manner. If you're coaching me, JP, and it's not creating value, then that's wasteful time. But if you're coaching me and it's holding me accountable to be more productive, then that's productive time.
That's right. So one of the things you talk about is this whole waiting around status quo sort of thing. And I'll probably get flagged for YouTube for saying this, but but you talked about discretionary effort, and I have a less elegant way of discretionary effort, acronym I call GAS, which basically means give a shit. And so as a leader, that's what you're trying to develop is that whole notion of getting an individual to that next level, but creating the environment where that want to is unleashed. Now, you and I, Dan, we've talked about sports in the past, and sometimes, those analogies will enter into this space. But I'm reminded of what happens when we take a great individual contributor and then we promote them and we give them a title, and then we say, voila, you're a leader,
Yeah.
And so tell me a little bit about that process, because when that happens in the absence of leadership development, we often see our CX strategy breaks. And I think about a sports analogy. They were a great player, horrible coach. And I'm sure we've got plenty of examples of that. So why is it so important to get this critical piece right and identifying the underpinnings of leadership so that we can drive the right CX strategy?
There's a huge difference, JP, between doing the work and managing the team doing the work. And when you work in the CX function, there's so much built around an escalation culture because customers are demanding that, right? If a customer is talking to a frontline agent and that response isn't a positive one or what they want as the final outcome, they'll sit there and say, what? Let me talk to your manager. And then it starts to bounce up. And when you think about some of the reports that, your leadership is studying, it's like, okay, yeah, there's the average handle time and there's the repeat calls, but there's also the, escalations. Part of this challenge for CX and care and retention type environments is that whole notion of why is it leaders get stuck in the doing versus managing the doing. So let's take an example. If I'm the frontline agent and I take the call and I get put into a place where I don't feel like I know the decision to be made, or I'm not empowered to make that decision, right? Then I escalate it to you, my manager, and you take it over from there, right? And now all of a sudden, you own it. I don't own it anymore. Now, think about this. How does that make me feel as someone that's trying to own the customer, that I can get to a certain point and then it's cut off and it has to be, focused to you? That's where discretionary effort comes in. If you're not going to trust me to be able to do this with the customer, or you're not going to bring me on that call, for example, to say, well, what Dan's saying, customer, is actually true, and I support Dan's decision, versus you, JP, saying, well, I'm the manager of Dan and I have the decision making power. And therefore, I'm going to make the decision and I'm going to use first person when I make that decision with the customer. Now you disengage the team member and you don't create a repeatable exercise. You don't create confidence in me, right? And so when I show up to that next customer, I'm going to work as hard as I can, but then I'm just going to bump it up to you because you're going to take it from there. And I create this escalation culture. So
yeah.
the patterns, again, that you're looking at are when you look at the frontline supervisors and the middle managers managing those frontline supervisors, are they doing the work or are they managing the work getting done? Because if you look at the patterns of the calls that I'm escalating, there's something that's happening on the front end that's making that where I have to escalate it to you. And your job isn't to solve what I escalate each individual time. That's playing whack-a-mole, right? Like that's productive, but it's not effective. Your job is to sit there and say, Dan escalated 6 calls to me last week, and 5 of them had to do with this. And oh, by the way, I've got 8 other Dans that report to me, and they're doing the same thing. What's the front end change that I need to create?
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think one of the things that's critical as we shift into our second point around the role of a supervisor is, although we may get a certain directive from here, it's really going to be that frontline leader who's really going to set the tone in a business. And so I'd love to expand on this. Why is at that level, why is that so critical, given that we've got the mission statements on the wall, we've got executives, but what happens in that piece, when that one-to-one with the person who's closest to the customer? You know,
Right.
Why is this role so critical? And more importantly, why is this often gotten wrong?
Right. You and I've worked with a ton of folks that live in this space every day, and we've had a lot of learnings, kicked in the shins a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
These audiences that we're talking about, these employees and the frontline supervisors, are both scrappy and savvy, right? And the ones that are really good at it create a relationship between supervisor and employee where they have each other's back. And
Yes.
the ones that aren't as good, right, are caught in this power struggle. So easy example is if I'm the frontline agent and JP, you're my manager, are you a teacher or are you a fixer? Right? Because that's a big difference. Both are problem solvers and both are probably putting points on the board to go back to your story.
That's right.
Right? But I want to work for a teacher. If every time I work for you, you're a fixer, it's an escalation culture where I don't feel empowered. But if you're a teacher, now you start to give the ball back to me and you sit there and say, Dan, how do you want to go after this? Right? Now you're teaching me to be more productive.
That's right. Because I see this interaction creates that engagement and that discretionary effort you talk about. And when you do that, you create tenure with your team. And tenure to me means that you have a team of subject matter experts. And that becomes critical in a lot of different businesses, but particularly in CX, because not only do I understand how to correct the issue, but I now have the wherewithal to correct the issue. As tenure increases amongst my team, I now have a culture of we understand the expectations and the escalations come down. And so where I've seen that attrition drop, from losing people, I've seen performance go up.
Correct.
I think about, 1 year where we dropped attrition by 1/3 and performance improved 20% because now you've got people who get it and you have leaders who are getting people energized around that.
So there's the first year to build that trust, right?
Yeah.
And there's that second year then to make it the norm, right? What I love is then going into the third year. How do you prevent getting into a pattern where teams won't question the leader? Because guess what? The business is going to change. The tools are going to become outdated.
Yes.
The processes are going to become outdated. So the question I would ask is, in the beginning of the third year, when you've got your mojo and everything's humming, right? Does the team have enough of a good relationship? Can I, as your direct report, JP, can I come to you and sit there and say, this approach, it's like we're holding it together with duct tape right now. Like, what are we doing to fix it? And now your job is to work with the rest of middle management to sit there and say, we're going to run out of duct tape soon, folks. And we're not blaming the front line when this does, right? Like, we've got to take ownership of this.
Exactly. We've got to make a deposit in that emotional account. So my last point on the supervisor role, I'm going to give you a chance to, I'm going to make this a little fun. Describe a great supervisor with 3 words.
Intentional, results oriented, we'll say hyphenated. And I would say flexible.
Awesome. So I think of it this way, and maybe I'm cheating, but I call it one word. First of all, I think there's SME, or a subject matter expert. Because I think you mentioned that earlier. Like, I want you to understand the role that your team does. So I want you to know a little bit about the business. Number 2, and you did speak on this earlier, you need to be a coach, which / teacher, however you want to frame it. But you've got to be able to build people up. You've got to be able to identify those gaps. And quite honestly, I think a great leader is probably number 3. They're probably a therapist at some point, because guess what? Life happens. And we have to manage around all of those different pieces while we're driving a business. So those would be my 3.
Love it. Love it. It's so situational. It changes from, you think about from that tenure perspective you talked about, like, what do you need in year 1 versus year 3?
Yep.
What do you need when you're launching a new product versus you're in a steady, stable environment? What do you need when you're getting ready to go live with new tools versus, you're swiveling back and forth between the dinosaurs that you've learned how to really navigate? It can change month to month, quarter to quarter.
Absolutely. So let's switch gears here. Let's talk about what is the difference between coaching and managing, because I think we've all seen managers who manage by metrics as opposed to coaching and developing their people. So how do we get here?
Well, look, the pressure that frontline supervisors and middle management feel is driven by executives wanting results. It's, pretty straightforward, and customers want results as well, right? So when you think about why we got here, we are in commercial enterprises, we are in for-profit organizations, we are using the most valuable asset that every organization has, which is people's time. And so if you can't be productive in that space, then you're not valuable, right? If you're not valuable, then maybe it should be automated, or maybe it should be sunsetted, or maybe it should be outsourced. And so the balance is around managing for the results and coaching for the increased performance. The question is whether or not you're going to lean on one versus the other, right? So going again back to, I'm based outside of Philadelphia, love basketball. And if you sit there and say team X wants to win more games, well, you've got to work backwards from that and saying, okay, well, what does winning more games look like? Well, winning more games means we score more points than they do, right? Okay, well, what does scoring more points look like? Well, that goes back to, you got 5 players on the court at any one point in time. They need to individually score more points than they're scoring. Okay, well, keep taking it backwards. And this is why data has become so prevalent in sports today, because I know that player A likes a shot from the corner better than they like a shot from the top of the key, right? So how does this all come together? From a management perspective, you as the leader need to look at that body of work and the data, and sit there and say, this is the most valuable pivot that we can make right now. This is the most important priority we can center on right now. And you can differentiate so that they don't have just this bucket list of items to care for. That's the management side. The coaching side is, if you and I were going to go out and ball together, if I'm a good teammate, I need to know where your favorite shot is.
That's right.
And if I don't know where, I ask basketball players this all the time when I'm coaching them, give me one of your favorite, one of your teammates that you don't know that well, what's their favorite shot? And if they can't answer, how can you be a great teammate?
That's right.
How can, like, you can't pass them the ball. You can't set a play up to give them their favorite shot. And I think the same thing comes true in when you're coaching team members, is like, you hired the person because they're capable. How do you set them up to make the shot? Right. Exactly. You got to give them skills and confidence and have their back around that. So to me, it's the combo of the two. And depending upon the day and the pressures that you're feeling, if you always focus on the results, then you're missing the equation. You're over indexing on what the business wants. If you over-index on what the individual wants, then you're just spending all your time coaching, but you're not sitting there and saying, does this cause us to score more points? Does this cause us to win more? It's the balance of the two you need.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about it as, coaching is really going to drive the people. And then it's the people who are going to drive the metrics. And so we really want to think about, for the outcomes that we want, what are the behaviors and the critical motions that have to occur to get us there? I think about stories where we were trying to be as efficient as possible in the business and we achieved the metric, but we lost sight of the importance of, from a customer experience perspective, it was more important to get things right the first time, which was important. But from the employee experience, it was also critical to understand what were the headwinds that were impeding their ability to get things done right the first time or in an expedient manner. And so as a coach, I have to look at all of those different factors and bring it together. So, to use a contact center metric, I couldn't just focus on average handle time. I needed to ensure that within the time it took to address a customer's concern, they got the right answer, and that the person who was speaking with the customer understood or had the tools and the information to get them there. So very, very important that, we can't just look at the number and hope for the best and say, hey, just try harder. But we have to coach around what is it that's going to get you there? What is it that's going to unlock your potential? And last but not least, because I always have to throw a sports analogy on here, but I got to talk about Michael Jordan in the first 7 years not winning a championship, but then he got a coach in Phil Jackson, and all of a sudden we saw a whole nother level in that performance. The same thing that we saw with Shaq and Kobe, a whole nother level of performance, and even probably more so with Kobe, because when he and Phil Jackson split, we saw 2 more championships show up. So for me, that reinforces that you can have all the talent, but as a coach, we have to unlock that next level that's really slight, but produces exponential results.
Yeah. Let me give you an example as well, JP, that I think will resonate with your listeners, especially if they're not a sports fan. So so many of us have cars, and many of us use the dealership that we bought the car from to service the car, right? This is a great example of, are you going to manage or are you going to coach? Which metrics are you going to pay attention to? If you do the research around most smaller auto dealerships that have a service embedded in their property, they'll create more revenue from doing the service work than they will from doing the sales work.
That's right.
Right. Yet,
absolutely.
When you think about how people are paid, right? Salespeople are paid more than the service folks. And you think about, like, if I was going to be loyal to that car dealership, it comes from, and I can think of my own relationship, it comes from my relationship with Rudy, right? I've known Rudy for 20 years. I've been through 6 cars with Rudy, right? And through that experience, I trust Rudy, and therefore I trust that relationship. Now you think about when you're trying to negotiate a trade-in value, or when you're trying to negotiate the cost of, new tires, or whatever the deal is, right? Like, the fact that I'm getting 10% off means that I'm a preferred, liked customer. And the manager that approves that is thinking about the full customer lifetime value, right? It's the same thing whether you're working in a contact center or whether you're working in a service space, of like, what's your customer lifetime value and how are you using this to trend out and let the customer have a relationship with the employee in a way that feeds whatever you want the next purchase to be, right? And I've seen this play out from a leadership perspective. Was working with a SaaS business, and they thought they were in the product business. I'm like, if you're in a subscription business, you're in a relationship business. You're not a product business.
Absolutely. You're speaking my language around customer retention. Let's switch gears here. Let's talk about the business case, because this all sounds great. We want the employees to be engaged. We want the customers to have great experience. Let's get down to brass tacks. As a CFO, I want you, let's put some dollars on the table now. Talk to me about, in the era of automation and leadership and all the different things that are happening, why does leadership still matter? Lay out for me why I should make an investment in leadership development.
Yeah. So the direct question is like, what are most contact centers going to go to a CFO for? They're going to sit there and say, I need more headcount, right? They're going to sit there and say, I need better tools, right? And the budget process kind of creates a discussion around that. What's a CFO going to come back with? I need you to show me that you're managing the headcount that you have today. If you have a team of 50 people working in a contact center, and all of a sudden you're like not getting optimal resources out of there, do you think that contact center leader is going to get approved for additional headcount? And should they? No, that's fiscally not responsible. And so when you look at leadership, it's the difference between managing an average team. I was working with a group the other day, and they were frustrated because they weren't getting support for additional headcount. I'm like, you have a team that you've just said is maybe operating at expectations. Maybe you even said below expectations. Why would a CFO want to give you headcount? And why would you as a leader feel like you're going to blame the CFO for not giving you headcount? Like, take a look in the mirror, pal, and like recognize that this is an opportunity for you to sit there and say, I need to hold people accountable. I need to make some change. I need my team to be fine-tuned here. And not just assume that more spend and more headcount is going to solve the problem. I do think tools can help, right? And the investment in tools, that's a leadership decision. But I think oftentimes what people go to first is that they need more headcount to solve the problem.
Absolutely. When I think back to the example I gave earlier about why tenure matters, I think about there's really three pieces, right? There is the hard cost to a business to actually go out and recruit to backfill at it, whatever level you need to drive the sort of experience that you want. So those are hard dollars. Number two is this is what I call the cost to serve, or the opportunity cost. Right. There is a ramp period involved with bringing anyone into a business as they get acclimated, as they understand where we keep the knives and forks and all of that. We can have the greatest product. We can be product led or sales led, doesn't matter. But there's going to be this natural learning curve till this person gets up to speed. And each engagement that happens with this individual versus quote unquote, your more tenured superstar, if you will, those are lost costs. Those are marketing dollars that don't get optimized. Those are, sales that don't get converted simply not because that person isn't great yet. It's just a learning curve that has to happen. Yeah. So that impacts a business. I think the third piece goes into first contact resolution in terms of, as I'm learning the business, there may be some bumps along the road. So I may not necessarily get it right the first time, which is all part of the process. But you think about these things happening at scale when you don't have the right type of attrition and engagement, it costs millions of dollars to the business. So for me, if you have a leader who can reduce that attrition, drive that engagement, those are millions of dollars back to the business, which I think are critical and not just nice to haves.
100%. That was my LinkedIn post this morning, was a tribute to a CFO that you and I both worked for, where it was $1 million is $1 million $1 bills. Right.
That's right. That's exactly it.
When you think about that, and we did some work, if you remember, with Joe Leipel, where it was like, okay, take your A, your B, and your C performers. And as a coach, think about your return on investment if you got one of those three groups to improve by 10%.
That's right.
Right. Now, what most leaders are put pressure on from their management is to go work with the C players. Right. And they'll over-index on those C players to try to get them to be B- players. And half of them will work and half of them won't. The question from a coaching perspective is, what are you doing to optimize your A players and allow them to get you 10% more? Because if they get you 10% more, that 10% is way more than getting 10% more from your C performers, right?
Absolutely.
So that's so key.
Absolutely. So I'm going to land this plane here. I'm going to leave the audience with 5 key takeaways, I think, from our discussion today. I think it goes without saying that leaders drive culture. I mean, and especially those leaders at the closest level to the business. I think number 2 is what I've seen across businesses, and I'm sure you have too, Dan, is that these frontline supervisors are just critical. I mean, they really are the linchpin and the unsung heroes of a number of organizations. I think number 3, if there's anything we've taken away, coaching is that golden thread. You're driving people not just metrics, because one will take care of another. You got to get your head out of the spreadsheet sometimes and connect with your teams. And then number 4, leadership development drives the effectiveness. We reduce churn, not just in customers, but in individuals for the reasons that we mentioned. And then number 5, it isn't a cost center. It is literally the revenue metric that no one talks about. So if you're not investing in your leaders or leadership development, quite frankly, you aren't investing in growth. And so if you get better leaders, you get better employees. And if you get better employees, you get better customer outcomes. I mean, that becomes a force multiplier. So any final words on those thoughts, Dan?
I couldn't agree more. I think it made me reflect on, we used to have that one model where it was like moments of misery, moments of mediocrity, and moments of excellence, right? And when you think about the differentiation between those 3 elements, there are so many instances where organizations will point to the front line and specifically customer-facing employee. And I would just say from a leadership perspective, I would encourage more management teams to take a look in the mirror, right? There's a quality expert, Deming, who used to talk a lot about that 90%, 95% of people come to work wanting to do a good job. That's pretty believable, right? And his second point was always an 85% of processed work is defined by management. So if you take that logic, right, the front line is executing on the plan that their management has put in play. And where managers can do a better job connecting with their frontline employees is recognizing that they either haven't been clear about what success, what moments of excellence look like, right? Or they're not holding people accountable. Those are both management leadership opportunities, not frontline employee experience deficiencies, right? So usually the focus here is sitting there and saying, what is the supervisory responsibility to raise the bar from being in that moment of misery to the moment of mediocrity to the moment of excellence? And that generally comes down to leadership.
Absolutely. And I throw in that last piece. People quit bosses.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So I want for my listeners out there, I want you to think about what type of leadership investment does your organization need to make today? If any of these messages resonated with you, I want you to drop us a comment, like and subscribe, and we want to hear from you, because the whole goal is to not only drive a better experience for our employees and a better experience for our customers, but unlock the tools that actually make us money and lead to profitable growth. So I want to thank my guest again, Dan Gallagher, for coming on today. I think this has been a great discussion. Can't wait to hear what our listeners have to say. And until next time, this has been Confessions of a CX Executive. I'm JP Dumas, and I look forward to hearing from you in the next one.